Hey, everybody. Welcome to the wonderful world of Remnant Radio. In this program, we're talking about the religion business. It's going to be an exciting program. You guys stay tuned. Welcome back to the wonderful world of Remnant Radio. In this program, we're going to be giving some commentary, some review commentary on the recent Docuseries, not a single documentary, not a single video, but a series of videos called The Religion Business, which is a documentary that was recently released and got a whole lot of steam behind it. Those who have produced it have gone on the Sean Ryan show. They've discussed with many other podcasts. They've got their own YouTube channel where they're creating lots of content. I think on the front end of it, I would recommend the documentary by and large, though there may be some things I disagree with. I think it does a lot more good than it does harm. I find that it's probably in the same category as I would consider the American Gospel documentary, which I overwhelmingly agree with, though I disagree with some of the charismatic statements they make at the end of the documentary. We're trying to do the best we can to call balls and strikes, kind of think through these things biblically and critically. And to do so, I've got a couple of hosts on the podcast with me to engage with some of that thinking. I've got Michael Miller and Michael Roundtree. Michael Miller is there on the right. Michael Roundtree is there on the left. How are you guys doing in your respective circles?
Doing well, man. Doing well. Just right after this episode, got a boy playing football. Got a couple of kids' birthdays this week. A lot going on for
Nice.
Family. I even have a men's book club tonight. So
a men's book club. What book are you guys going through?
Right now, it's called Black Fortunes. It's the story of black millionaires after the Civil War. It was a really interesting book. It's just guys in my neighborhood and a bunch of guys wanted to get together. I started it, but really good conversation. We've done one other book and do a different genre each time, so it's kind of fun.
This is interesting.
Interesting. Miller, do you have a book club?
I don't. No, not much going on my end of the world. I watched the memorial service yesterday, and dude, I couldn't fight back the tears listening to Erica Kirk share what she shared, but then two, to forgive her husband's murderer. And man, that has been these last 2 weeks. I've had knots in my stomach as every new article comes out and everything. Man, it has been wildly intense to see the vitriolic response online. I'm just like, I don't know. Have you guys gotten swept in all of this stuff? Like, because that's what's been like, honestly, always pressing on in my mind for the last 2 weeks since it happened. So,
yeah.
I
followed it pretty closely.
Go ahead, Roundtree.
That's it. Just said I followed it pretty closely. But what were you gonna say?
Oh, nothing. I'm just saying I had church service last night and this morning had to get all this stuff together for the various shows that we tape and film and that kind of thing. So I haven't had a chance to watch the memorial service, but I've definitely followed the events closely and have seen quite a bit on my feed. Super proud of Roundtree's video doing a response kind of, hey, how do we think about this as Christians? I thought it was a fantastic video and encourage people to go check that out for those who are interested in it. One thing that I didn't mention at the top of the show, my marketing director will kick me if I just, digitally, because she is too far away from me to actually reach me, is that we do have conference registrations. I'd encourage people to go check out theremnantradio.com. You register for the conference taking place this fall. I think you've got a week and a half to still register for that conference. There are still a few spots available, but we're actually pretty full already. So very much encourage you, if you want to go and check out the conference there in Houston, Texas, just north of Houston in the Woodlands, go check it out over there.
How many seats do we have left for that conference, Josh?
I don't have the answer of that off the top of my head. I think we're more than 80% full. We might be close to 90 at this point. Actually, I think we are close to 90 at this point. We have seats available, but not a ton. So, last time we sold out, and I think we'll be pretty darn close to that this go round as well. So religion business. Miller, you were the first, I think, to put this on my radar. But yeah, tell me a little about the documentary, that kind of stuff. You've watched quite a bit of it already. I guess we'll start over with you. What are your thoughts on it?
I'd actually been following the making of this before it came out. I think my own experience and what I've seen in the past and just how money gets tossed around in churches, I was always kind of like, kind of curious. You know what people value by where they put their finances. And as this was coming out, I knew I had on the front side of this some concern because I was like, last thing I want to do is discourage people from regular church attendance. And so I was worried that this documentary could do that. But I also knew at the same time I was going to find myself agreeing with most of it, like the need for transparency in finances, the need to talk about where money actually goes when it comes in, and the rights of people who give when it comes to how money is used, and at least some knowledge of it being used for what they were told it's going to be used for. And then I also knew that it would bring up some theological, ecclesiological questions about where money should go, scripturally speaking, because a lot of people have a lot of opinions on these things. And so I was pleasantly surprised overall with everything I've seen so far. I've watched his interview with Sean Ryan as well. And in that, he said some things that were somewhat concerning to me, but overall, large agreement. And so I'm really excited that we're finally doing a response to this, because I wanted to as soon as any of the documentary came out. And I know that we've just been busy and haven't had the chance to really, it's a lot of time you have to commit to that documentary. And sadly, we couldn't pull clips from it. So we've had to just piece together things that that were stated. Normally we get to pull clips in and give you guys a more full review, but we'll do our best in this show.
Yeah, the paywall system that they have set up is really good. So, hey, congratulations, guys. If you're trying to prevent people from bootlegging your documentary, you did it well, which means I couldn't do any screen grabs and record and just kind of do 2-minute response clips and engage with this or engage with that, which we've done in the past, which is great. Kind of a fair use response to engaging with the documentary. But we've got some of the core tenets of that kind of laid out in our show notes, and we're walking through those a little bit by little bit. I generally agree with Miller. I didn't know so much about this documentary as its process was forming, but I did watch the Sean Ryan interview and also said, hey, you know what? This was really well done. They definitely know their stuff. I don't necessarily agree with all of the conclusions in that podcast, but I generally agree with a broad, sweeping kind of overview of this documentary. I guess I'll start at the top, and then I'll just get you guys to give some feedback as we keep going through this process. And in the documentary, they'd stated over and over that there was not a requirement for churches to disclose their information to the IRS, because churches are exempt from the normal nonprofit 501c3. That's the taxable, like, kind of verification system for nonprofits is a 501c3, and that these churches are kind of exempt for submitting those documents, the 990, that would then disclose all of their major income and assets and those sorts of things. And that is technically true, but it's not entirely accurate to all churches everywhere. So I tried to glean as much information as I could on this, and because all this stuff is not necessarily publicly facing and publicly accessible, I had ChatGPT try to crunch some numbers for me, and this is not trustworthy. As you know, ChatGPT, when you don't have source material, it may be guessing. It would say that like 42% of churches actually file these Form 990s, which kind of helps me introduce the subject matter of what a church has to file versus don't have to file. There are two different forms of filing for a church. You can go through the formal filing process or the informal filing process to become a nonprofit church. The formal filing process makes you essentially a 501c3 organization like every other organization, and you are required to do certain things. You have to kind of review of your expenses in that Form 990, your assets and liabilities, executive compensation for some of the most paid individuals on your team. There's got to be a governance and board structure that's clearly laid out and submitted to the IRS. Program service accomplishments, like what specifically did your organization do, related organization transactions. And the Schedule B is basically says, hey, here are my major donors to this organization. And you have to make all of that stuff publicly available and facing. So as far as I can surmise, a good chunk of churches, and I think the majority of churches I've actually even been a part of, have gone through this formal process and do file a Form 990, making that accessible for not only their donors, but for the IRS and national scrutiny at large. So if you were to right now go look up Glory of Zion, you could research their Form 990 and see that Chuck Pierce was paid, I believe it was $1.3 million. I think it was in 2022 or 2023. You can go back and look at those forums and say, okay, well, I actually know what their guys are getting paid. And that's a ton of money. That doesn't include maybe his personal ministry, book sales, his own, travel expenses. But these churches are paying these individuals X amount of money. And if they go through that formal process, you can actually figure out what those individuals are paid. But then you have the kind of informal process. And the informal process doesn't require you to submit this information to the IRS. It is not, I would say, legally required for a church to do this, but many organizations actually take advantage of this system. I would say things that don't constitute a church. For example, when I worked at Daystar Television Network and I asked what was the guy's role? I think he was in charge of HR. I was asking him about the nonprofit status of the organization. Turns out Daystar did not file the formal 990. They filed through an informal 990 stating that they were a church. And because they were a church, they bypassed all of those requirements for submission of payroll and those sorts of things. That's really concerning because that is not a church. It's a media organization. But they would say, hey, look, this is where our donors give. We have a live studio audience where they come and attend church and engage in worship and teaching. We check all of the boxes that are required to be a church in the eyes of the IRS. Therefore, we are a church, and they're able to get all of the church benefits without any of the disclosure necessary that most nonprofits would engage with. I don't think that instinctively says that anyone who doesn't go through that filing process, I mean, with organizations like Daystar, I think it's reprehensible that they don't do this and that they claim that they're a church when they're clearly not a church. But there are other organizations and other churches that choose not to file the formal process. And the reason being is that they don't want the IRS involved. They don't want the government involved in how their church functions as a whole. The worry is that potentially another administration is going to get in that intentionally targets the church and wants to have access to all of the way that they're spending finances so that they can come in and seize assets. I think one of the primary concerns is specifically with the Schedule B of major donors, where those major donors are revealed to the IRS. And lots of churches are saying, hey, I don't want you to know who goes to my church and who doesn't go to my church. And if I file this information, you have access to all of my church members. And if there is a tyrannical government at any point in time, I want you out of my books. So those are some initial thoughts. Just kind of, I know I'm monologuing a lot on the formal, informal process. The documentary seemed to state that basically all churches don't file this, where we actually know for a fact that many of them, in fact, do file a Form 990, and like most other nonprofits. But that's kind of a finer point of the documentary, and it's not like a major point of the documentary. Most of the emphasis of the documentary is look how all of these finances are being mishandled, in which case we say yes and amen. That's not good. We shouldn't mishandle those finances. Okay, so I've monologued a little bit. Any you guys want to weigh in on anything that I've mentioned on formal or informal filing processes?
Sure. I'm kind of laughing. It looks like we have an accountant and a nonprofit accountant in the chat. He says, I've yet to see a church file a 990. This is Mike Hedden, with doing nonprofit auditing for over 15 years. Maybe they're organizing as something other than a church. Then he says Schedule B would be completely overwhelming given how common tithing is. So yeah, Mike, I guarantee knows more about tax law as a specialist in that area than we do. But my guess that would be that the overwhelming number do the informal process and call themselves a church. And sometimes sometimes the reason could be shady, as you referenced and as the documentary references. And sometimes it could simply be they're small and they're just trying to make stuff happen, and it's like one less box they have to tick. Maybe it's that. I don't know. If I'm trying to give the benefit of the doubt, I don't think that every single person who does it has shady motives. But when you have this kind of thing, it definitely can open a loophole for lots of shady motives, as you mentioned, Josh. So I think that would be my 2 cents.
Both of your churches have filed the formal recognition of a nonprofit, right? Y'all fill out 990s in both of your churches, right?
I actually didn't file a 990 for my church, or I haven't yet. And it's actually for the exact reason Michael just mentioned. We do have full disclosure, though, for our members, exactly where every dollar goes. And so we have quarterly meetings where we have somebody who's a non-paid member at the church who's in a deacon level position, and he has full access to everything. So I don't see who gives what, but he allows everybody to know where all the money is going. And so our members have complete say-so in that. And they also have a great deal of say-so on where the finances go when it comes to making big decisions. So like when we made the decision to move into the space where I currently am and move to a Sunday morning service, I was like, look, guys, this is more responsibility. I've already got plenty. If you all as members want to move to a Sunday morning service and you want to have a space that we can call our own, then you guys have to make this decision, and you have to own the repercussions of that decision as members in our church. It's part of the reason we have formal membership, though, so that we have people that can make decisions within the community, because it's their money that is being donated to allow this church to happen. Now, when it comes to areas of doctrine, church discipline, we typically as elders will handle most of those decisions, unless there is a need to excommunicate, in which we would bring the whole church body into that decision. Anyway, that's where I've been. We haven't done that. I've told my executive pastor I would like to start doing that, and now I have an executive pastor. And so when it comes to some of the more administrative stuff, hopefully we'll start having that take place. But this is another thing, I think, especially for us who are in small churches. My church is only like 100 to 120. Something that needs to be considered, and I worry about the documentary doing this. I know that they mostly focused on the big churches who failed to disclose where the money goes. And it's probably not the same for a lot of small churches. But when you get into ministry, I went to seminary, or I didn't go to seminary, but I did get discipled by a seminary prof. But even those who do go to seminary and they get a degree to teach the scriptures and doctrine. You know what they don't get trained in? How to set up your organization with the government, how to file your 990s. They don't give any kind of financial classes that I know of about balancing a church budget. Those things are usually not what pastors are trained to do in many modern seminaries. I'm not saying that we get to acquiesce our responsibility to do those things. I do find it interesting. There seems to be an educational gap when it comes to meeting the standards that the government may require, or that people today might require because of the misuse of finances and donor money. That's a long little monologue there.
Yeah. Roundtree, do you want to weigh in on your end? I don't know how you guys y'all are a brand new church.
No, we actually do the informal process at this point. We just, in our church, it started, like I started with this board that as we were kind of gradually became a church in October. So we started meeting in May, I guess, of 24, and then became a church in October of 24. And so we had this board of legal and financial experts, and they just they did all the stuff. In fact, one of our board members, our founding board members, was an IRS basically fraud detector. So definitely had to make sure that we were dotting the I's and crossing the T's. So we're informal process at this point, but we also highly value transparency and accountability. And so just had a members meeting where we put out, I think, a highly transparent meeting on finances. And we also, our church has a lot of elders. We have central elders is what we call them, as well as house church elders. And so one of the things we said in that members meeting was anyone who's on this full council of elders can have access to salary information as well, which is actually quite a number of people. So we highly value transparency and accountability, but we do go the informal route at this point.
Yeah. And here's another thing that's really important for people to know. If you go formal, it's really difficult to go informal. Like legally trying to shift your organization and the paperwork, it's really easy to go the other way around. So from what I understand, and I've been told this, I'm not a tax guy. I'm not an IRS.
You're a pastor, just like me. I have no idea what you're doing when it comes to that stuff.
I have no clue what I'm doing. I've been told if we wanted certain grants to take care of homeless folks and get government assistance for those sorts of things, we would need that formal recognition process. And we decided, hey, if we ever want to get to the place where we need need government assistance for taking care of people or things that are taking place in our local church, we can make that shift, but we can never go back, or never might be an excessive term. It's much more difficult to go back than it is to go forward. So I understand why churches would not want the government super involved in who the donors of their church are, with all of the scrutiny and kind of I don't know, conspiratorial ideologies that are kind of floating around about U.S. government at this point. So I at least can sympathize with people who have not gone through the formal process and chose to go informal, realizing that they can change that at any point in time that they would like to. The next thing in the documentary that was brought up is this idea of church auxiliaries, which often function as essentially shell corporations. The number one example that was used is the LDS church essentially has a hedge fund where they were tossing a bunch of money into. And it seemed as if one of the reasons they were tossing all this money into that was so that when members of their church, according to like their bylaws and their governance rules, if they've been tithing regularly, they get access to all of where the finances. But this auxiliary group, they don't have access to the finances of that organization. So it seems as if, hey guys, we need you to keep tithing, we need to keep giving money, but we don't actually want you to know where that money is going or how much of it we have. And they were able to hide it in this other fund. They showed through the documentary that the LDS church is essentially, when you kind of stockpile all of their auxiliary branches and what they've purchased, that they're the second largest owner of land in the United States, whether it be farmland, whether it be companies that they've purchased that function as auxiliaries. And the idea is that these organizations are essentially being used to raise funds and support for local church mission. The way that you and I would probably see this most often is with a church owning a coffee shop or a thrift store or maybe a bookstore on the corner, and they would go out and purchase that, and then they would use the proceeds of that said organization to fund missions or to supplement church salaries or to take care of the local church's needs. But as we would see in that documentary, many of those private endeavors end up kind of stockpiling, smoke machines, fancy lights, people's salaries, opposed to actually caring for people. And we're going to get into that here in a moment when we talk about where funds are going, because I think this is somewhere that I actually, maybe with a nuanced way, disagree with the kind of meta narrative that is being painted by the documentary as a whole. Though when they talk about things like transparency, I think any church member who's a member of a local church should be able to go to their church and say, hey, I want to know where resources are going. And I think the church should be responsible to say, oh yeah, here is where the resources are going. But on the flip side of it, what would happen if a church purchased a gym and a coffee shop and an automotive store of some sorts, and they were able to cover all of the expenses and the operational expenses of the church so that people's tithe could go towards, their offerings could go towards taking care of the widows and the orphans and the homeless and those sorts of things. I would say, in principle, church auxiliaries is not necessarily evil. The way that they've exposed the use of church auxiliaries, I think, is ultimately evil, because these guys are sitting on, millions of dollars salaries, those kinds of things, which I think is which is a gross mishandling of finances. As far as church auxiliaries go, do you guys think there's a huge danger in churches acquiring different businesses? Am I living in a fairy tale to think that a church could use all of these finances and resources to supplement church budgets? Would that be a good thing, bad thing? Weigh in.
Man, I'm nervous about churches establishing, one, shell organizations. It just doesn't even sound good, but just the whole kind of business, like money earning side of things, makes me nervous in terms of, like, you're getting tax-free status and you've got this side business. And so you take a donor's money and you invest it, and the investment goes poorly. Feels a little dicey. So, I would feel nervous about that, and I think the great safeguard is transparency. So, you have to qualify investments too. Or if we're talking about the stock market, that's one thing. If a church is, let's say, quote, investing in land across the street, you could land is real estate. You could call that an investment. But what if their plan is to extend a parking lot into that? Well, that's different. And so even the word investment can be used in different ways. So, but a church should absolutely not be investing in, some sort of like high risk and hope of high return sort of thing with people's donations, and they should be responsible stewards who are forthright with the people about whatever quote unquote investments that they're making.
I think the problem you're seeing in all of this is there's always a few bad apples that ruin it for everybody. And so when you have these people taking advantage of the system, taking advantage of the privileges that churches get because of the separation of church and state, and when that happens, it ruins it for those who might be taking good use, not advantage of, good use of those privileges and using it for the right things. And so the real question for me is transparency. Um, like if we wanted to start a coffee shop here at Reclamation Church in Denver, Denver's a great little spot for coffee. There's so many coffee shops and they make a lot of money, or they do pretty well, I'd say. I would love to have that. I would love to have a place where members of my church regularly came and we actually used the facility for more than just, because right now, like today, it's light empty most of the day. The only person that's been in here today has been me. And so I would love to see the space utilized for stuff like that, especially if it was able to take care of one of our missionaries that we just sent to Hungary. That would be awesome. So I have no problem with that. I just think if I'm going to use that kind of money towards a business, that it needs to be disclosed to the church before that ever even happens. And then when it comes to the money that comes in from that, there needs to be some clear line items in the budget showing what income is coming in, exactly where that money is going. So transparency is the name of the game.
Yeah, and I want to make a comment too about when it comes to churches and the subject of optics. So there's ethics and there's optics, and they actually both matter. I mean, ethics is you do what's right, you don't do what's wrong. We all know what that means. But optics is also something that needs to be considered. So, for instance, what if you're doing something that you feel can be justified ethically and biblically on that side of things so that it's right? But what if it just kind of looks shady? Well, we had to start this shell organization, that kind of deal. And so optics is where that transparency piece comes in, and you invite people in and say, kind of, here's what we're doing. Does this look right to you too? And a couple of verses here, Acts 24:16. While on trial, Paul says, I always take pains to have a clear conscience toward both God and man. Romans 12:17, he exhorts believers, give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. And so, yes, we want to honor God and have high ethics, but we also want to do things that are obviously ethical to all people, because there is such a thing as gray areas. And if a church is trafficking in gray areas, it and they're not transparent about it, that's going to look like not a gray area to some people. By definition, since it's a gray area, some people are going to say, I actually think that's unethical. And even if your conscience says it's okay, and if a chunk of the congregation is saying it's actually not okay, that's a problem. Paul says, do what's right, honorable in the sight of all. 2 Corinthians 8:21, in the context of financial stewardship, Paul says, we aim to do what is honorable, not only in the Lord's sight, but also in the sight of man. So I think when it comes to finances, it's not just ethics that come into play, it's also optics. And so a church should really endeavor to be honest with their people about what's going on. And if they feel like they have to sort of squirm a little bit to explain why they ventured into this gray area, then that's actually a problem. Even if it was theoretically justified in the sight of God, God himself in his word says you actually should be seeking to do what's right in the sight of man. So if there's ever a question, the congregation, like Miller mentioned on the coffee shop, like I could imagine a congregation full of donors who are saying, hey, one side's like, coffee shop's great, we can fund these missions initiatives, we could do all these great build community, and they have all these biblical missional sort of ideas as what they can do with it. And you might have another group of people who's saying, coffee shop, that's like, come on, can we care for the widows and orphans? Like, I mean, do we really need to be more caffeinated? And do I really want my donations going to that facility? We're already paying for our church facility. And so it looks like a gray area to them. Then I think the solution in gray areas is you just be honest with your people and say, hey, here's what we're contemplating. We think this is justified in the eyes of God, but we want to, on an optics perspective, we want to bring this up before you guys. And so those kinds of conversations, and even if you're an elder governed church and your congregation doesn't get a vote on those matters, it's still, I think, on matters where you're pressing into like what we're talking about, I think it's good to get some congregational feedback on that kind of thing to make sure it truly is honorable in the sight of all.
So I like that because that's a nice way to kind of land the plane on auxiliaries. We would all essentially say they don't have to be inherently evil, because an auxiliary could literally just be someone in your church who's like, hey, I want to start a nonprofit and I want to take care of widows and orphans. I want to use 100% of my efforts to do that. And we say, cool, we're going to create an auxiliary for you to do that. It will be an organization under the heading of our church, and you will spearhead that. You will raise it your own support. Our church will support you in that. That's an auxiliary. It would be also appropriate for someone to say, hey, we want to start a coffee shop and we want to make sure that, a quarter of the proceeds go back to the church to fund regular everyday mission. But again, as long as the church as a whole is okay with that perspective, I think that we would kind of come on board with that. We get really into these dicey situations where there are a group of elders or individuals of leadership in the church that are making executive decisions and potentially putting people's finances at risk that they've donated to the church, at a potential of losing an investment because they've invested a whole bunch into this coffee shop and it totally floundered and buckled and there was no support for it. And then we've just wasted all of this money. So I think the general agreement on our team, auxiliaries, not inherently evil, not inherently bad. But if we're going to do this, do it with transparency. I think that's a good way to land that plane there. Let's talk about private inurement. This is where, and I might not be pronouncing that word right, but I think it's correct. It's where individuals within the organization are profiting. It's a nonprofit, but these individuals are profiting. An example in the documentary was Kenneth Copeland has a 19,000 square foot home on Eagle Mountain Church's property, and that is a parsonage for him. It is a mansion. But additionally, it's important that the viewers understand he doesn't actually pastor Eagle Mountain Church any longer. So this is a pastor emeritus, a guy who founded the church, who's living off of the church on a mansion that the church is paying for. So that's a difficult pill to swallow, and that's clearly benefiting from the church as an operator of that church and that organization. I would say the same thing would be true of an individual who I just published a book and I'm going to have my church purchase 10,000, 100,000 copies so that I get on the New York Times bestseller list. One, you are kind of using your church for personal gain to get on that New York Times bestseller list, but you're also being compensated by your church purchasing all of these books, even if you're handing them away for free in your church. I think that's kind of shady, but that kind of thing happens all the time in very large churches that are under this 501c3 umbrella. Individuals, there's one that comes to mind, but I didn't fact check it before I jumped on the program. So, but individuals have clearly in the past used church funds to purchase vehicles for families, friends, loved ones, that kind of thing, as a way, oh, this is just a gift. This is an offering from the church. We're going to mark it under benevolence, and we're going to buy this guy a car. But these vehicles have been extremely expensive vehicles, and people don't know that their finances are going to those sorts of things. Well, this would be considered inurement, where individuals are profiting from this nonprofit organization, using it as their own personal piggy bank. That's a really serious problem that I think as the church as a whole, we've got to combat. I don't think entirely the response for the church needs to be policing what everyone else is doing with their money necessarily, but each individual local church holding their own local church accountable for how they're spending their money. Where did this money come from? Why did we buy that vehicle? Would it have been more financially responsible to purchase them a used vehicle as they were looking for work and job, and their car broke down and they got a family of 5? Cool. Let's take care of them. Let's go buy them a used 2002 Honda Civic. I'm trying to find the date, and I was like, why am I having a hard time with dates? I'm having a stroke over here. Civics and Corollas last forever. Let's buy them a used car and take care of these people. But these personal benefits of the nonprofit has been to essentially be lavish in a lot of situations. It's really important, again, that we pick up on what Miller said. Most churches in America have got 80 people, 60 people in them. Like they're not these all-star mega churches. And that's a very, very small percentage of the national church at large. And I think this is happening at a very small scale, maybe in local churches, and a much larger scale where there's a lot of finances to shelter. So thoughts on this, guys?
Yeah, the numbers get skewed in this documentary, but they're not so like when they say this amount of money comes into the church as a whole across the globe, and here's where the money goes, and they start portioning off where each thing goes. One of the things that they're not telling you is that it is a small number of mega churches that are skewing those numbers because the average church isn't that big. The average church is probably my church's size. And so when it comes to the
Actually,
benefits,
actually much
go ahead.
smaller. I mean, it's been a few years
Yes.
since I've seen the number, but it was like probably 60 people was your average church. That pastor ain't getting rich, and that's your average church. So
No.
maybe it's 80 now. I don't know, but anyway. But yes, to your point, Miller, there's a small number of pastors who are getting rich off of it, and probably the bigger problem in churches is that pastors don't make enough to feed themselves. That would probably be the bigger problem. And so anyway, but to the point of this documentary, it is a problem. And when but Miller, I interrupted, so go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking like the kinds of provisions and benefits that pastors can get that help them financially. One of them is the housing allowance, which they took a great deal of time to talk about. They talked about Ed Young and how he got a housing allowance that was just massive, how his wife got a housing allowance, how his son got a housing allowance, and go on and so on and so forth. And you're going, oh man, that's not like something's off here. And again, I look at that and go, this is what this does is it makes guys like me who get a housing allowance look like I'm a bad person for taking advantage of that opportunity that's afforded to me. The fact is, the housing allowance I get, it might be considered high if I was at Josh's in Ada, Oklahoma. Um, but it's not for Denver, Colorado. In fact, I can't actually afford with the housing allowance that I get to live in the vicinity of my actual church. Like I bought a house further down south. And here's the thing, even to get a house half the size of the house I live in now, I still couldn't afford to live in the vicinity of my own church building. And so I think that's, again, it's concern for me because it's not considering what the average pastor deals with. It paints a broad stroke over pastors. And I don't think the guy doing the documentary would ever intend this at all. I worry about that being a repercussion though. I worry about the kind of scrutiny that all pastors already face. And if you ask the average pastor why most pastors leave ministry, you're going to find a large chunk of pastors. The statistics actually show that one, they can't afford to take care of their family. That's a big one. Two, the amount of conflict and scrutiny that they come under wore them out to where they didn't want to do the job any longer. Those are the two highest reasons why why people get out of ministry. And this documentary, while I think it's actually doing the right thing by exposing those who are taking massive advantage of the system, in my own mind, I'm going, gosh, I wonder what kind of headache I'm going to have at my church because I haven't had a public 990, even though we've publicly shown to our members exactly where the money goes. It's concerning to me. Do you guys have that fear at all?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, part of me has landed in the place of I don't care. Like people are going to be upset no matter what. Like in my church, I'm not worried about people being upset. I worked for our church for free for a very long time, and now I get a housing allowance, and that's what I get. Most pastors who pastor a church that's the size of my church, which is about 80 members, they work bivocationally, and that's what I do. I get paid from Remnant Radio, and my church doesn't compensate. I mean, I started doing ministry in 2012, and until I've planted my church, and I don't even think my church would even, break this rule, but I've never been paid more than $20,000 a year in ministry, living in Dallas and Illinois and the various places that I've lived doing ministry stuff. I think most pastors, to Roundtree's point, are severely underpaid. Now, I would hope that in my context, I would really enjoy that Remnant Radio would be my full-time salary, and I would never have to take a salary from the church. That would be pretty stinking ideal, that I could just kind of come and serve the body of Christ and not be a burden on the church and the resources of the church. And those resources could go to take care of the local needs of our community. And when I say our community, I don't mean Ada, Oklahoma. I mean our local church, which again is something that we'll get into here in a moment in the documentary. But I think by and large, yes, I see more problems. Are people on the outside who are looking in going to be upset with pastors and finances? Yes. But we live in a day of like rage cancel culture where everyone is really excited to jump on a bandwagon and point the finger of who's doing things that are wrong. And I think that there are things that are wrong that need to be pointed out. But I also think that when you turn yourself into a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I've internally processed this to the point that goes, okay, my income is publicly available. You can, shoot me down and be upset with it if you don't like it. But that's really not my problem. I have a clean conscience before God. I have a clean conscience before my church. I have a clean conscience before anyone I do ministry in front of. And all of that stuff is publicly facing so they can find it if they want to. I don't care. I feel pretty confident with what I'm doing with my life. And as long as Jesus is okay with me, I'm okay with that. Roundtree, you got any worries?
No, I don't have any worries. No, so I don't really have any further comment on worries about that. I was thinking about, back on the housing allowance. The housing allowance for pastors, it is, in my opinion, it is kind of an antiquated thing and kind of random to us as in modern times where churches don't typically provide a parsonage, like a house for their minister to live in right next to the church. And so the housing allowance kind of developed from that, and churches don't do that anymore. And so whatever a pastor spends on his house, housing allowance makes that tax deductible. But then on the flip side, the way it also works is that a pastor, just by being an employee, is typically considered self-employed. So he has to pay 15% taxes, whereas the average 15.3 technically, the average has to pay about 7.5 if they're an employee. And so, there's just give and take, and it's just kind of weird. But it would be also weird to like blame a pastor for taking a housing allowance that the government says this is perfectly legal and good and right to do. So in fact, I think you would be a bad steward if you said, I'm not going to take a deduction that I could otherwise take. So anyway, when you started getting into tax law, again, none of us are experts, but I think it is a little weird for pastors. I agree with that. In my mind, it should just be the same as the way it is for any other employee in terms of how pastors are taxed. But whatever, you win one, you lose another. Self-employment tax, housing allowance, it is what it is. So anyway, so those are a couple of thoughts on the tax law.
Yeah, there was a really interesting point in the documentary where they were saying, hey, look, all these ministries, all these activities that the church is doing, how are they going to support all of this? So the church has turned to tithe as a way to take care of all of the various activities that are taking place in the church. I think this is an important piece of discussion because I actually agree with the overall sentiment of the documentary on the subject of tithe. I don't believe tithe is as a requirement for New Testament believers as it was with the children of Israel in the Old Testament. I'm going to do a quick walkthrough of like kind of how I see tithe as it operates in the scriptures. I've done a whole episode on this, so people can go check it out. And the primary arguments from those who say tithe is mandatory is that tithe was established before the law. They would appeal to Abraham giving a tenth of his income to Melchizedek. They would then say tithe is explained by the law, that every tithe of the land, whether seed of the land or the first fruits, is to the Lord's and is holy to the Lord. If a man wishes to redeem some of his tithes, he shall add a fifth to it, and every tithe herd of the flock and every tenth of the animal of all that pass under the herdsman herdsman's staff shall be holy to the Lord. One shall not differentiate between good and bad, neither shall he make a substitute for it. And if he does substitute it, then both it and the substitute shall be holy. It shall all be redeemed. That's Leviticus 27:30-33. So we see, hey, Abraham says, I'm giving a tithe to Melchizedek. Here we see the law is talking about what that tithe is. It's making it very clear that it's produce of the land. It is the seed of the land. It's the animal, that kind of thing that comes up from the people. The people who would say that tithe is still really, really important will appeal both to before the law, in the law, but then they'll say Christ affirmed it in Matthew 23:23. Woe to you, Pharisees and hypocrites! You tithe mint and cumin, but you neglect weightier matters of law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness, though you ought to have done so without neglecting the other. Here in this passage, Jesus is saying, you're not retiring your family members the way you're supposed to. You're saying, oh, it's all Korban. I'm giving it all to the church. And he's saying you're so careful to take care of like tithing, mint, and cumin, these really small things, but then you're like neglecting your parents and you're not retiring them because you've given it all to the church. You're not honoring mom and dad. So you're neglecting this weightier matter of the law, and you're laxing up the mint and cumin tithe. You're totally cool. And it's just unjust weights. So Jesus is correcting that. And then they would say, hey, we shouldn't steal from God, appealing to Malachi 3:6-12, which says, hey, you've got to give this to the Lord. You're not robbing man, but you're robbing God when you don't tithe. Now, my response to this, and do you guys want to weigh in on this? I don't want to monologue this entire time and commit thunder theft. Do y'all
Sure.
want me to seal this out, or
I'll comment real quick, and then I'm going to peace out and go to my boys' football game. But yeah, I actually agree with you. I don't think the tithe is a New Testament command. I think that you could say it's a biblical principle that extends kind of beyond the law, in that it appeared before the law was given. But with that said, I've never preached Malachi chapter 3, for instance, in a way that's like, hey, if you don't give 10%, you're robbing God. I actually don't believe that's true. I think in the New Testament, giving is talked about with some frequency, and it's never said give 10%. Instead, what we see in 2 Corinthians 8:9 is Paul saying, for you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. As it turns out, Jesus didn't just tithe his blood. He spilled all of it. And so that's how we need to think about our finances. Not necessarily that we give all of it away, but we need to hold all of it loosely. It all belongs to God. And I think the picture there is essentially be radically, lavishly generous with your money. And in my own life, I've never less than tithed 10%. But with that said, I don't view it as a New Testament command. I do think that, 1 Corinthians 6 does speak of giving in proportion to what you earn. So there is a New Testament concept of giving regularly and proportionally. So 10% kind of makes sense, but I would never tell somebody, hey, you're giving 8%, sinner. I wouldn't do that. I just advise people to give sacrificially, proportionally, regularly, worshipfully, to do those kinds of things, and cheerfully. So that's really, I think, the New Testament focus. And I think when we turn it into a legalistic requirement, it becomes a God tax, and that's not what we want. And there are some complicating factors too with the Mosaic Law, because their tithe is as part of a theocracy. It's going into all kinds of things that we don't have to think about as New Covenant believers. But I do think regular, proportional, sacrificial, cheerful giving, it should be the New Testament model. And if somebody wants to give 10% and that they believe that's right for them, all power to you. Praise God. That's awesome. Yeah. But generally, we should just be generous people.
Yeah, that's good. And I wanted to give Michael a chance to, say his piece before he had to bail. So if I were to run through the argumentation that was just made for those who said, hey, tithe is mandatory before the law, in the law, Jesus affirms it, don't rob God. I would then go through that argumentation and say circumcision was given before the law, right? But it's not required in the New Testament. So just because it was before the law doesn't mean it transcends part of the moral code and the moral order. It's part of the moral code and transcends the law of Moses. Then I would say technically Abraham gave 10% to Melchizedek one time. It wasn't a perpetual 10% of all of his income forever. It was a one-time thing in a battle that was someone else's crap. It wasn't even his own stuff. He went and fought a group of people who had stolen all the wealth of Sodom and Gomorrah and all these other folks that were in this big battle. They had run off, and then Abraham and his 300 guys went down, defeated them, and came back with the spoils of war, and then gave everything back to Sodom and Gomorrah except for the 10% that he gave to Melchizedek. So there's no evidence that Abraham did this in continued perpetuity, that he was always giving 10%. Abraham gave voluntarily and not out of his increase. It was someone else's content. And this practice was borrowed by a lot of the cultures in that day that would give 10% of a tithe to a priest in their day. So Canaanites and other cultures such as this during that period would have done a similar thing. Now, the idea that tithe is explained in the law, hey, it was mentioned before Abraham, then it was explained in the law. Notice that all of the law codes for tithing is about produce of the land. It has to do with animals. It has to do with, even Jesus says, mint and cumin. You won't find a single reference to the Mosaic Code referring to tithe as money. And people would say, oh, it was an agricultural society. No, it wasn't. They had money. In fact, in the Bible, you'll have, I think it was like, I don't want to do this from memory, tons of references to coinage before we ever get to, the Levitical codes on finances. So yes, they were agricultural for sure, but they definitely had access to monetary wealth. Every time this is referenced, it's referring to the land, it's referring to animals, it's referring to specific food. And the reason it's doing that is because the Levitical priest didn't have a portion of land. So you have the 10 tribes, those 10 tribes, or 12 tribes, then give, I'm sorry, it would have been 11 because Levi would have been excluded from that, right? The 11 tribes then give 10% to the one tribe, Levi, who doesn't have land. They can't grow their own food. They can't have their own livestock. So the purpose for the tithe was essentially to feed the Levitical priests, and then what was left over took care of widows and orphans who couldn't be cared for locally, which is why you see the reference in Malachi about there being food in the storehouse. And that's why you need to give tithe, was because the Levitical priests are starving, and you're building your own house rather than caring for these priests who are wringing out their lives, giving you the thing that you need, which is reconciliation with God. So tithe in all of these passages, even with Jesus, is referring to food, and it's directed towards Levitical priest. We don't have Levitical priest in the New Covenant. There is no portion of tribes giving to a group of people who don't have any land. So in the New Covenant, tithe is not mandatory as it was in the Levitical system, taking care of Levitical priests under the Mosaic Code. I agree wholeheartedly with everything Roundtree said. We should give sacrificially. We should give as the Spirit leads. And when you go to the passages of Scripture where they gave as the Spirit led, when Moses said, hey, give your gold, give your silver, your fine jewelry, and that kind of thing so that we can build this temple, they had to tell the people to stop. We've got too much. Stop giving your stuff. Or when in Acts 2, they gave as the Spirit led, they gave everything that they had to the apostles. So I think that the model that we see in the New Testament is kind of Spirit-filled, Spirit-led, sacrificial giving rather than give 10%, because I don't think that is the mode. But I have seen it used as a manipulation tactic to demand of everyone to give. I would encourage, if you're a member of a church, you should give as the Spirit leads, but not under a kind of mandatory system of giving. Miller, do you have any comments on tithe?
No, I think you and Michael and I have all been on the same page about this. Like, I ask my church if they're members to tithe. I don't require it. And I always tell them, look, if you can't pay your bills, pay your bills. Don't spend money on the church, but definitely be generous. I mean, that, at the end of the day, that's the kind of people we want to be. And generosity is honestly the measurement for what that looks like is between you and God. And it's the same thing with, like, how much time do you read your Bible? How much do you evangelize? How much do you pray? How much do you memorize Scripture? Like, when it comes to all the disciplines of our faith, all the things we know we should do, nobody ever feels like they're doing enough. And so I don't want to lay a burden on people that God does not lay on them. I do want to encourage the values that would lead to these kinds of things, being a generous person.
And every church is going to tackle this differently.
Right. So it's the values that I encourage, not necessarily mandates on exactly what that looks like.
Yeah. And for us, like in my church, the way that we would handle that is we wouldn't talk in terms of tithe at all. I would just say, hey, give as the Spirit leads. I talk about offering, talk about giving, totally fine. But I don't even use tithe language in my church for intentional purposes. When we do our membership meeting, typically there's someone who raises their hand and is like, hey, what's your requirement on tithe? And I would say, well, we don't even use that word. We're going to talk about giving sacrificially. Yeah, so we do with that. This is a really important thing, I think, in the church, in the documentary, that I would like to tackle as we kind of close out this program. It's the internal use of resources versus the external use of resources. One of the things that this documentary does, it goes to, a village, in a third world country, and it's like, look at all the needs that are here. Look at all the orphanages of people that need to be taken care of. Only cost, $23,000 a month to take care of this orphanage and these women. And then it would go to the megachurch, who the guy's got like 3 private planes and that kind of thing. And kind of contrasting, look where we're using our resources, look what all the good that could be done. I totally understand that and get that. But again, I want to ask the question as it relates to someone who's got a member members, 60 members of their local congregation. Like, where should most of their resources be going? Should a good 50% or 70% of their resources be going to humanitarian aids? And what does the Bible explicitly state about churches and how they use their resources? I would just say on the front end, for me, there is a biblical command to take care of those who labor among you, right? A worker is worthy of his wage. So there is a biblical responsibility we have to take care of those who are doing ministry in the church. There's also a biblical command to take care of widows. But that command to take care of widows, as we see in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 3 through 16, talks about certain qualifications. A widow has to be a certain age. And of that certain aged widow, she has to have taken care of her husband and cared for her family well. She has to be well known in the church, but she's not to be put on the roll of the church if she doesn't mark those qualifiers, which means that the church is not kind of indiscriminately taking care of all widows and all orphans everywhere. There's a focus on taking care of the household of God first and foremost. And there's that passage in Galatians where it says, do well to everyone, but especially to the household of God. There seems to be a focus on resources being used internally for the church. In Acts 2, they gave everything to the apostles. And what did the apostles do in turn? They fed their local people there that were members of their church. And that's where they appointed deacons, was to make sure that the distribution of food was taken care of well, and that those individuals were being cared for and fed. So I see a responsibility first and foremost in the scriptures to take care of the individual. And though I see passages of Jesus talking about going to prisons and caring for those who are imprisoned, to go and take care of the widow and the orphan, and then when we do that unto the Lord, I question whether that is the focus of the organization or if that is the focus of the individual. If a church member wants to give their resources to a church and that church says, hey, I'm spending 25% on salaries of people in our church so that we are equipping our saints to do the work of the ministry. And, we are spending 50% of our budget on, local facilities, right? And we're spending another 25% of our budget taking care of resourcing our local assembly. That's 100% of your budget right there. Well, how do you get away from that? How do you have any wiggle room there? And I think, again, this is a agreement that your local church has to have on how you want to use resources. I think it'd be great to have a quarterly split. 25 go to staff, 25 goes to facility, 25 goes to the resources of the local church, and 25 goes to missions and benevolence and those sorts of things. I also don't think that's a problem. I think that this documentary, if you walked away from it, you might be thinking to yourself, most of the church resources need to be going towards these humanitarian aids. But again, if tithe is not a mandatory thing and you have finances and resources to use and you want to use those to take care of widows and orphans, I'd say do that. But the focus of the church should be gospel proclamation and training up their local assembly to do that gospel proclamation and be the hands and feet of Jesus. So in one sense, I agree with the documentary and how, finances are being lavishly spent in a kind of indiscriminate sort of way. But then on the other hand, I'm not necessarily in agreement that the church that's got, 60 or 80 people that's spending a ton of money on building and equipping their folks and taking care of their pastor, like if they don't have extra resources, are they in sin? I don't think the scriptures actually place them under that category of sin if that's how they've chosen to use those resources. So those are some of my thoughts there. I know, Miller, you had a similar kind of heartache when watching the film. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's very clear in scripture that first, the priority of finances when it comes to benevolence goes first to the church itself, those who have needs within the community. I think, again, it's a couple of bad apples that we're seeing in these mega churches and celebrity churches where so much of the money is going to the wrong places when these churches could actually be doing a lot of good. And that's the really sad part about it. My concern is the same here as it was, as I expressed earlier. It'd be very easy to walk away from this documentary thinking this is how all churches just are. In reality, a lot of churches are barely scratching by. Barely have enough to just make the bills. Several pastors seldom get raises and have enough to take care of their family. So, it also is another question to be asked is it wrong for a church to pay for a building? Why? Is there any biblical precedent for having a building? I mean, when you look in the scriptures, most of the churches in the early church were rather small and they met in homes. But that's not necessarily because they wouldn't have met in a building if they could have. It's because that's what they had available. These people were extraordinarily poor. especially the Jews at the beginning of the Jesus ministry and after they trusted in him as Messiah. One of the ways the poor got fed was they showed up and they had communion together. And so I think context matters. And in the context of today, I think it's fairly normal if a church, like I know for a lot of the families in my church, they want a building. They want to know that their kids are not just being, taken care of and playing on a playground, but they want their kids to be discipled. And that usually means developing a curriculum. And that usually means hiring a children's pastor to develop that curriculum or buying it from somewhere else that you use that curriculum for. There's just a number of areas where the expenses go. And again, I think that's entirely up to the church body itself to decide where the finances go. And I don't
And
think
then
that's a wrong thing.
you've got tons of questions about safety with like new people coming to church. There's a huge question on like, okay, I'm going to go to your house and I've got my kids and the adults are going to stay in this room. And then you're going to take my kid to your backyard or into the basement and you guys are going to do a Bible study.
Totally. Yeah.
And there's no cameras down there and you're a strange family and I'm in this house. It's like there's actually a cultural problem today. Like kids ministries needs cameras. They need background checks. You need like those things that cost money. And again, when we think of in terms of context, we should just do everything in a home. And it's like, how many strangers do you think are going to just show up at someone's house? Like, I think in a realistic way, we have a context and a responsibility to kind of care for people in our context. And for some people that's having a building. I'm saying this as a guy who doesn't have a building, right? But I do have to plan events and things that we do as a church. And those kinds of concerns come up like, well, are we gonna do this in someone's home? Are we gonna do this in a location? And if we do this in a location, is that going to, or in someone's home, is that going to prevent people from coming? Because, we're new kids on the block and people don't feel safe in some stranger's house. So there are some, I think, legitimate concerns that we have to wrestle through. Ultimately, what I would just say is I agree with the documentary's assessment of a problem. There is a problem. I don't 100% agree with the solutions. And that was a comment made by Mike a moment ago, the CPA or the tax guy who was helping nonprofits. That's ultimately where I'm at. It's like, you see the problem with finances, you see the lavish lifestyles, you see how there's not accountability and transparency. I agree with all of those things, but I think that the focus then, for me, the solution then is not more government oversight. I don't think the answer for me is going to be that the church kind of go underground and meet in homes exclusively and not in larger locations. Go watch the video that Michael Roundtree did on house church versus megachurch, and which one's more biblical, because he actually goes through the New Testament and talks about how there were halls of Tyrannus and these kind of big, large marketplace gatherings and local churches. They went to the temple daily and house to house. And there were these larger gatherings and smaller gatherings that were used in tandem throughout the early church. And I think that would be a model, I think, for many of us to embrace and exercise along with that. Okay, that's a whole lot for me, man.
Thought here.
Please.
Yeah, one closing thought. I was 15 years old when I came to Christ. Came up in a broken home, divorced parents. Dad didn't pay child support. Mom raised 4 kids on her own. I became a Christian when I was 15. I would find the friends who went to church on Sunday morning, and I would stay the night at their house Saturday night so that I could go to church on Sunday morning because I was a genuinely curious kid. I wanted to know Christ. I wanted to know the scriptures. I wanted to know all that God had to offer through the church. And church was the safest place in the world for me. It was a cessationist church. Today I disagree with some of the doctrine, but at the end of the day, man, that youth group was so life-giving for me. I had a youth pastor I could talk about my problems with. I had 2 different men in the church that would meet with me regularly and disciple me. We went through the book of Isaiah. I had a young life leader who also used the church building for his young life club. The church let them do that. The youth pastor would also show up to the young life club. And so the church space, it really was a place of discipleship for me and all of my young friends. I was also fortunate that I had a physics teacher who was a believer, and he let us meet in the mornings and we would do devotionals together at the school. All I got to say is I think there is so much, scandal going on right now in some of these places that this guy is right to point out. But I also want to remind our audience and all others who might stumble upon this podcast that the church could be something really amazing, as it was for me as a kid who came from an unbelieving Jewish family. It was really something amazing. And one of the elders at that church, when I when I came forward and talked about the sexual abuse that I had suffered as a kid, it was one of the elders of the church who also happened to be a PhD licensed therapist that I opened up to and told him what happened to me. And he gave me free counsel and helped me heal and forgive and deal with my trauma. And so I don't know. I have so much hope for what the church could be. And I even have that kind of hope here in my own community. I hope that we can use the space that we have now been entrusted with for ways that are really good and godly. I hope that it's filled with warmth and smells that come from food and potluck dinners and scripture reading and prayer. I want to see all of those things. And for that reason, I love the church. I love church buildings. And I hope that many people won't be so disillusioned by what they see because of the scandals, that they'll find that there is a good space for that.
That's a good takeaway point, because we can get so discouraged by what we see out there at large that we forget that we actually have a responsibility in our own local assembly. Man, if every person who watched this video would say, hey, I'm gonna make sure that my church lives with transparency, and we're gonna care for the people that come into our doors, and we're gonna take that internal look to make sure that we're doing things above board, it would protect us from all of the other things that come downstream of that. And it's an actual solution, opposed to how do I fix Kenneth Copeland's church, which you're not going to. Like, you can make as many sounds and alarms. People have been doing it for decades. People who want to go to that church are going to go to that church. The best thing that we can do is make sure that our local assembly is accountable and transparent and is using resources in a wise and biblical way. So I think that's a really great way to wrap this up. Guys, thank you so much for tuning into this episode. Very much appreciate all your viewership. Man, share this video around. Like, share, subscribe, all that fun stuff. And we will see you in the next program. Peace out.